It was the summer of 2017 when my mom decided we needed a break from city life. She'd been a police officer for 20 years, and the job wore on her, though she'd never admit it. I was 22 at the time, fresh out of college, and the idea of spending a week in the woods wasn't exactly my idea of fun. But Mom insisted, saying it was the perfect way to unplug and bond. She chose a remote campground in northern Michigan, near the Huron National Forest. It wasn't one of those family-friendly places with showers and electric hookups. This was primitive camping, no running water, no cell service, no one around for miles. The drive there took almost 6 hours. Mom was in her element, the car packed with gear. Tents, sleeping bags, a cooler full of food, and her service weapon, which she always kept close. Just in case, she'd say whenever I asked why she brought it everywhere. We reached the campground late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the thick trees. The place was eerily quiet, with no signs of other campers. That didn't seem to bother Mom. She just said, "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves." With a smile, we set up camp in a small clearing near a narrow, winding river. Mom handled the tent like a pro while I fumbled with the stakes. By the time we finished, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was cloaked in darkness. The only sounds were the distant calls of birds and the gentle gurgle of the river. That first night was uneventful. We cooked hot dogs over a campfire and talked about life. Her work, my plans, the usual stuff. When it got late, we doused the fire and climbed into the tent. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the soothing sounds of the forest. The next day, we decided to hike one of the nearby trails. It was hot and humid, the kind of weather that makes your clothes stick to your skin. The trail was overgrown in places, with thorny bushes scratching at our legs. Mom seemed unbothered, her years on the force making her immune to discomfort. I, on the other hand, was miserable. We didn't see a single person during the hike, which struck me as odd. This was a public campground, after all. You'd think we'd run into at least one other camper. But the trail was deserted, and the farther we went, the more uneasy I felt. After a couple of hours, we reached a clearing with an old, rusted fire ring. It looked like no one had used it in years. Mom suggested we take a break, so we sat down and drank some water. That's when I noticed it. A faint but distinct smell, like something rotting. "Do you smell that?" I asked, wrinkling my nose. Mom nodded, her expression serious. She stood up and started looking around, her hand instinctively resting on her hip where her gun was holstered. We didn't find anything, and after a while, the smell faded, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, things took a darker turn. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise, something rustling outside the tent. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or a deer, but then I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Mom was already awake, her hand on her gun. She held a finger to her lips, signaling me to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then came a low, guttural sound, like someone clearing their throat. Mom unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. I could see her tense up, her body rigid. She didn't say anything, just motioned for me to stay put. Then she slipped out of the tent, her gun drawn. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear what was happening. There was a muffled thud, followed by the sound of something crashing through the woods. Then silence. Mom came back a few minutes later, her face pale. "It was a man," she said quietly. "He ran off when he saw me." The next day, we packed up and moved to a different site, farther from the trailhead. Mom didn't seem as rattled as I was, but I could tell she was on edge. She kept her gun within arm's reach and jumped at every little noise. The new site was even more remote, surrounded by dense forest. Felt safer at first, but that night, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. There were whispers, low and indistinct, like multiple voices carrying on the wind. I tried to convince myself it was just the trees creaking or the river playing tricks on my ears. But then I saw a light, faint and flickering like a flashlight, moving through the trees. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out who or what was holding it, but it was definitely there. Mom grabbed her gun and flashlight and stepped out of the tent again, telling me to stay put. I watched the light disappear into the woods, then reappear, closer this time. Mom disappeared into the darkness, and I sat there alone, clutching my knees, trying not to panic. Minutes felt like hours. When Mom finally came back, her face was grim. "We're leaving," she said. We packed up in record time and started the drive home. Mom didn't say much, her jaw tight, her eyes scanning the road like she was expecting trouble. I asked her what she saw out there, but she just shook her head. A few miles from the campground, we passed a beat-up pickup truck parked on the side of the road. There was a man sitting in the driver's seat, watching us as we drove by. His face was expressionless, but his eyes followed us, unblinking. We didn't stop until we were back in the city. Even then, Mom didn't seem to relax. She called a colleague at the local police department to report what had happened, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. A few weeks later, I came across a news article about a missing hiker in the same area where we had camped. The article mentioned suspicious circumstances and said the authorities were investigating. I showed it to Mom, and she just nodded. "That's why you trust your gut," she said. "To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods with us. But I do know one thing. I'll never go camping again." It was late in the evening when I arrived at the campsite, a small clearing by a creek deep in the woods, the kind of place I had discovered through word of mouth. Secluded and quiet, perfect for a solo camping trip to get away from the world. I had been planning this weekend getaway for weeks, hoping the rain would hold off, but the sky didn't look promising. Dark clouds were already gathering, heavy and low, like the sky itself was about to collapse on top of me. I was used to camping alone. It was a way for me to disconnect, to think or not think as I needed. The solitude felt freeing. There was something deeply satisfying about setting up camp in the quiet of nature, surrounded only by trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife. My backpack weighed heavy with supplies, but I managed to make my way through the overgrown trail that led to my site. The path was muddy from a storm the night before, but I was used to roughing it. By the time I had set up my tent, the first few drops of rain began to fall, slow and steady. I figured I'd have just enough time to start a fire before it really picked up. I gathered some firewood and started trying to strike a match, but the wind was picking up, making it harder to keep the small flame going. It felt like the weather was already against me, but I was determined to make the night work. The fire eventually caught, though it was weak, struggling against the rain and wind that was intensifying by the minute. As the storm rolled in, the sounds of the forest became more pronounced. The wind howled through the trees, and the occasional crack of thunder made my heart jump in my chest. The creek that ran near my site was growing louder, the water rushing faster with the rain. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of discomfort, like the storm was somehow too aggressive, almost as if it were trying to drive me away. I sat by the fire, wrapped in a thick jacket, my eyes flicking between the weak flames and the dark forest beyond. The crackling of the fire felt too loud in the silence of the night. The rain was relentless now, a constant sheet of water falling from the sky, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the woods in sharp, white bursts. But even with all that light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. The trees swayed and creaked, their branches bending under the pressure of the wind. The sounds were familiar, yet tonight they seemed different, more ominous. I leaned back against a rock, trying to relax, but the unease that had settled in my chest wouldn't go away. I told myself it was just the storm, just the isolation of being alone in the woods, but deep down I knew there was something more to it. Something wasn't right. I felt it, a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. As the hours wore on, I started to get anxious. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and I found myself glancing nervously at the treeline every few minutes. Every rustle of a leaf or crack of a branch set me on edge, but nothing ever came of it. The rain kept pouring, the creek grew louder, but no animals came around, no hikers passed by. It was just me and the storm. I decided to retreat into my tent for the night, hoping that the sound of the rain and the warmth of my sleeping bag would lull me to sleep. As I lay there, listening to the storm rage outside, my mind kept racing. It was hard to ignore the feeling that something or someone was out there watching. I kept telling myself that it was just the storm playing tricks on me, but the feeling only grew stronger, like something was right outside the thin fabric of my tent, just beyond the rain and the wind. The night dragged on. I finally drifted off to sleep, only to be jolted awake by a sudden, loud crash. My heart leapt into my throat as I sat up, listening intently. The rain had lessened slightly, but the wind was still fierce. I grabbed the flashlight beside my sleeping bag, heart pounding, and shone it around the inside of the tent, trying to make sense of the sound. Nothing, just the rain against the canvas, the wind outside, and the crackling of the fire that was slowly dying. But the crash, it felt real, like something had hit the ground hard, maybe a branch or a tree falling nearby. I tried to push the thought out of my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay back down, pulling the blanket tightly around me. My eyes drifted shut, but sleep didn't come. Every creak of the tent, every rustle of the trees outside, kept me awake. Couldn't let my guard down. Then, in the dead of night, I heard it. A faint noise, something like footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching in the mud outside my tent. It was soft, almost too soft to be real, but it was there. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps weren't the result of wind or rain. They were real and they were getting closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the sound of the rain and the wind. Then, a soft rustling at the edge of the tent, something brushing against the fabric. My pulse raced. I slowly reached for my knife, hidden under my sleeping bag, and waited. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if someone was actually out there, but I wasn't taking any chances. The rustling continued, closer now, moving around the tent as if whoever it was circling me. I heard a low, quiet noise, something that sounded like a grunt, barely audible over the storm. My stomach twisted. I held my breath, listening, waiting, my grip tight on the knife's handle. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The footsteps, the rustling, everything went silent. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if I had truly heard someone out there, but the absence of noise made everything seem worse. Whatever it was waiting just out of sight. I stayed perfectly still for what felt like an hour, but no more sounds came. Slowly, I got up, grabbing the flashlight again and unzipping the tent cautiously. The rain had stopped for the moment, but the air was thick with tension, the trees swaying violently in the wind. I could see nothing unusual at first, just the outline of my campsite, the dim glow of the dying fire. But then, in the distance, I saw movement. Someone was moving quickly between the trees, their figure just barely visible in the gloom. I felt my heart race again. The figure was moving toward me, and I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulder, and silently crept toward the edge of the campsite. I didn't know who or what it was, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. The last thing I wanted was to face whatever had been lurking near my tent. I stayed low, my eyes darting between the trees as I made my way along the perimeter of the camp. Every step felt like it might be my last, but I kept moving, pushing myself further into the woods, away from the campsite and whatever had been out there. After what felt like an eternity, I made it to the nearby trail. The storm had calmed down significantly, and the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The sound of the creek rushing beside me seemed louder now, more comforting. I paused for a moment to catch my breath and gather my bearings. I didn't know if the figure had followed me, but I wasn't willing to take any chances. I kept moving, my feet slipping in the mud as I made my way down the trail, the forest quiet around me. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched, exhausted, and shaken. The last thing I wanted to do was go back to that campsite. I wasn't sure what had happened, but something had definitely been out there. Whatever it was no longer a part of the night storm. But the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting, didn't leave me as I drove back home. The campfire still flickered in my mind, but it was no longer a comforting warmth. It was the last thing I remembered before the night turned into a nightmare. The woods had claimed something that night, something I couldn't explain, and I never went back. It was the summer of 2021, and I decided to take a break from my usual routine by going on a solo camping trip with my dog, Max. He was a large German Shepherd, always alert and protective, and I figured his presence would make me feel safer in case I ventured into unknown territory. I was searching for something off the beaten path, a place far away from crowded campgrounds and noisy tourists. Scrolling through some old hiking forums, I stumbled upon a thread about an abandoned campground in the heart of a forest about 5 hours from where I lived in Montana. According to the post, the site had been closed down decades ago after a series of accidents, and now it was just a forgotten spot that only a few adventurous people ever visited. The description intrigued me. It sounded remote and peaceful, exactly what I was looking for. I loaded up my truck with camping gear, food, and plenty of supplies for Max. The drive was uneventful at first, with wide open roads and the occasional small town. As I got closer to the forest, the paved roads gave way to gravel and dirt. My GPS became unreliable, and I relied on a printout of directions I had found in the forum. The entrance to the abandoned campground was easy to miss. A narrow, overgrown path marked by a rusty "no trespassing" sign. It was obvious no one had been maintaining it for years. I parked the truck just off the main road, grabbed my backpack, and let Max out. He sniffed the air excitedly, his tail wagging as we started down the path. The trail was barely visible, covered with leaves and undergrowth. Every now and then, I spotted remnants of the old campground. A rusted grill, the decayed frame of a picnic table, and what looked like the remains of a signpost. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of nature, birds chirping, insects buzzing, were faint, almost muted. It felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After an hour of hiking, we reached what seemed to be the main area of the campground. There were several dilapidated cabins scattered around, their roofs caved in and walls covered in moss and vines. A fire pit sat in the center, filled with charred wood that looked decades old. I chose a spot near the fire pit to set up my tent. Max stayed close, his ears perked up as he scanned the surroundings. I spent the afternoon exploring the area. Most of the cabins were too unstable to enter, but I peeked through the broken windows. Inside, I saw rotting furniture, old mattresses, and piles of debris. One cabin had a shelf lined with jars filled with what looked like preserved fruits, though the contents had long since turned black and unrecognizable. Another had a collection of rusted tools scattered across the floor. It was eerie but fascinating, like stepping into a forgotten piece of history. As the sun began to set, I returned to the campsite and started a fire. Max lay by my side, chewing on a stick. I cooked some canned beans and shared a portion with him. The night came quickly, and with it, a chilling stillness. The forest was pitch black, the only light coming from my fire and the faint glow of the moon through the trees. I crawled into my tent, Max curling up at my feet. I had just started to drift off when Max growled softly. It wasn't his playful growl. It was low and threatening. My eyes snapped open and I listened. At first, I heard nothing but the crackling of the dying fire. Then, there it was, a faint rustling sound coming from the direction of the cabins. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. Max was already on his feet, his body tense and alert. I stepped outside and shone the light toward the cabins. The beam illuminated the crumbling structures, but there was no movement. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I added more wood to the fire, hoping the light and heat would deter anything from coming too close. Max eventually settled down, though he remained watchful. I stayed up for a while, staring into the darkness, before exhaustion finally overtook me. The next morning, I found footprints around the campsite, not animal tracks, but human. They were faint but unmistakable, leading from the edge of the woods to the fire pit and then back toward the cabins. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't heard anyone approach during the night, and there were no other cars or signs of people nearby. I decided to pack up and leave, but my curiosity got the better of me. Before heading back to the truck, I wanted to take one last look at the cabins. I told myself I'd just do a quick sweep and then get out of there. Max stayed close, his nose to the ground as if following a scent. As I approached one of the larger cabins, I noticed something I hadn't seen the day before. A hatch in the floor, partially hidden beneath debris. It was slightly ajar, revealing a set of wooden steps leading down into darkness. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I tied Max's leash to a nearby tree. If there was something dangerous down there, I didn't want him getting hurt. I climbed down the steps, the air growing colder with each step. My flashlight revealed a small underground room, its walls lined with shelves. The shelves held jars similar to the ones I'd seen earlier, but these were intact, their contents preserved. There were also boxes filled with what looked like old camping supplies, lanterns, cookware, and blankets. In the corner of the room was a desk covered in papers. Most were illegible, the ink faded and the pages brittle with age. But one page caught my attention. It was a list of names, each followed by a date. The dates spanned several decades, the most recent being 1998. My name wasn't on the list, but that did little to calm my nerves. As I turned to leave, my flashlight caught something on the ground. More footprints, leading from the stairs to the desk and then stopping abruptly. I didn't want to think about what that meant. I scrambled up the stairs and untied Max, who was growling again, his hackles raised. We left the campsite without looking back. The hike back to the truck felt much longer than it had the day before. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. Max stayed close, his eyes darting toward every sound. When we finally reached the truck, I threw my gear into the back and climbed into the driver's seat. Max jumped in beside me, and I locked the doors before starting the engine. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in those woods. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the footprints, the hatch, and the list of names. Who or what had been out there with us? And why did they keep a record of people who had visited the campground? I never found answers to those questions, and I never went back to that forest. Some places are better left forgotten. I never thought much about the woods until that trip. It was supposed to be a weekend of bonding, a break from the grind of our everyday lives. My name's John, and I was 28 at the time, working long hours in construction. My team, a group of 6 guys including me, had decided to spend a weekend camping. We figured it would be a chance to blow off some steam, share some laughs, and enjoy the quiet of nature. The plan was simple. We'd drive up to a spot about an hour outside town, set up camp near a lake, and spend a couple of nights away from it all. The spot wasn't too far from civilization, close enough to feel safe, but far enough to avoid other campers. It was late October 2018. The air was crisp but not too cold. The trees had shed most of their leaves, and the forest floor was a mix of damp earth and scattered twigs. We got there around mid-afternoon on Friday. The drive had been smooth, with laughter filling the car as we joked about work and shared ridiculous stories. As we unloaded the gear, I noticed how quiet it was. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint chirping of birds. I didn't think much of it. After all, that's what we came for: peace and quiet. We set up camp in a clearing about 50 yards from the lake. 2 tents for sleeping, a central fire pit we'd built for warmth and cooking, and a few folding chairs. Once everything was in place, we cracked open some beers and settled in, enjoying the late afternoon sun reflecting off the lake. By evening, we had a fire roaring, and the smell of burgers filled the air. It felt good to relax, surrounded by nothing but trees and open sky. After dinner, we sat around the fire, talking about everything and nothing. The night grew darker, and the stars came out, clearer than I'd ever seen them in the city. Around midnight, most of the guys decided to call it a night. I wasn't tired yet, so I stayed by the fire, feeding it small branches and enjoying the solitude. That's when I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It came from somewhere in the woods behind me. At first, I thought it was one of the guys stepping out to relieve himself, but when I glanced at the tents, the zippers were all closed. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. Still, it was unnerving. I kept the fire going a little longer than I'd planned, hoping the light would scare off whatever it was. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The sound didn't come again, and I managed to fall asleep. Saturday morning was uneventful. We made breakfast, joked around, and spent most of the day exploring the area. The lake was calm and beautiful, and we even tried some fishing, though none of us caught anything. By late afternoon, we decided to hike a bit deeper into the woods, just to see what was out there. The forest was dense, with tall pines and the occasional oak. The ground was uneven, and we had to navigate around fallen logs and patches of muddy ground. About an hour in, we stumbled across an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, with its roof partially caved in and the door hanging off one hinge. Naturally, curiosity got the better of us. We poked around, finding little more than rotting wood and rusted nails. Still, something about the place felt off. It wasn't just the decay, it was the silence. The birds, which had been chirping earlier, were quiet now. Even the wind seemed to have died down. One of the guys found an old, rusted axe leaning against the wall of the cabin. It looked ancient, with the handle splintered and the blade dull. He joked about taking it back to camp, but we all agreed it was better to leave it where it was. That night, we were back at camp, cooking hot dogs over the fire. The mood was lighter than it had been at the cabin, and we were all in good spirits. But as the night wore on, the same feeling I'd had the night before came back, the sense that we weren't alone. I noticed movement in the shadows just beyond the firelight. It was subtle, a branch swaying, a patch of darkness shifting, but it was there. I didn't say anything at first, not wanting to seem paranoid. But then one of the guys pointed it out too. We all turned to look, but whatever it was had stopped. The forest was still, the fire crackling the only sound. We laughed it off, blaming our imaginations, but the unease lingered. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise outside my tent. It was a low, steady scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. My heart raced as I lay there, listening. The sound grew louder, moving closer to the tents. I wanted to wake the others, but fear kept me frozen. I could hear it now, right outside. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I stepped out of the tent and saw it. A long, deep gouge in the ground, starting near the edge of the camp and leading off into the woods. We decided to pack up early. None of us admitted it out loud, but we were all on edge. As we loaded the cars, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. On the drive back, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too far to make out details, but it was there. We never talked about it again, and I haven't been camping since. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just an animal. It was something or someone watching, waiting, and I'll never forget how it felt when I saw that figure, knowing it was still out there, somewhere in the woods. I had been looking forward to my solo camping trip for weeks. It was the perfect escape from the noise of everyday life. Just me, the woods, and my thoughts. I planned it all out. A small, secluded area along a creek in the mountains.
No crowds, no distractions.
Just the peace of nature. I packed everything I'd need into my backpack and headed out early in the morning. The weather was perfect, cool enough to keep the bugs away, but warm enough that I wouldn't be shivering by nightfall. It was early October, and the leaves had just started turning. The colors were vibrant, a mix of fiery reds and golds. The air had that crisp autumn smell, the kind that makes you feel alive. I was alone, but I liked it that way. It had been a long time since I'd had any peace of mind, and this was exactly what I needed. The hike to my campsite wasn't too bad. It was a few hours on a narrow trail that wound its way up the mountain, cutting through thick trees and over rocky ground. The sound of the creek below was a constant companion, gurgling and splashing as it made its way downhill. I had done this route before, but something felt different this time. Maybe it was the solitude, or maybe it was just the time of year, but the woods felt unusually quiet. Too quiet. Every now and then, a bird would call out in the distance, but aside from that, it was dead silent. When I finally reached my campsite, the spot was just as perfect as I remembered. It was a small clearing, nestled between two large oak trees, with the creek just a few yards away. I could already picture myself sitting by the fire, the crackling sound and warmth against the evening chill. I set up my tent, made sure everything was secure, and started collecting wood for a fire. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I realized how far off the beaten path this place really was. I hadn't seen anyone else the entire hike. That night, as the stars started to twinkle overhead and the fire crackled beside me, I felt a strange sense of unease. It wasn't fear exactly, but something was off. Maybe it was just the isolation. I wasn't sure. I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. The forest had a way of making you feel small, but that wasn't anything new. I ate my dinner, listened to the sounds of the creek, and let the stillness settle around me. Eventually, I climbed into my sleeping bag, hoping for a good night's sleep. But just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it, a rustling. It was faint, but it was there. My heart skipped a beat. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It sounded human. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My breath caught in my throat. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, maybe, but there was no wind. The night was still and the noise didn't stop. It was coming from the direction of the creek. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, wide-eyed, straining to listen. Then, out of nowhere, I heard something else. A low groan, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging across the ground. Panic surged through me. My mind raced. Could someone be out there? Had someone gotten lost in the woods? I had to check, but at the same time, I was terrified of what I might find. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, trying to keep as quiet as possible. Outside, the air was cold and smelled of damp earth. The firelight flickered behind me, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. I stood still for a moment, listening intently. The noise had stopped, but then, just beyond the trees, I saw something dark and unnatural. I slowly crept toward the edge of the clearing, shining my flashlight in the direction of the creek. It was there that I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a large rock or a fallen tree, but as my light caught it, I realized it was something much worse. A body. It was lying face down on the ground, half submerged in the shallow water of the creek. The limbs were twisted at odd angles, and the clothes were torn and soaked. I could see the dark, crimson stains on the clothes, and the water around it had a reddish hue. My stomach churned. I knew I should have turned back. I should have run, but something kept me rooted to the spot, staring at the figure in the water. My pulse was racing, my thoughts a jumbled mess. What happened here? Was it recent? Had someone been murdered? I needed to get help. I needed to get to my phone, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the body. I had never been this far out in the wilderness. There was no signal, no way to call for help. I had to make a decision fast, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground, and every part of my body screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't. I had to know what happened. I approached cautiously, stepping over branches and rocks. The closer I got, the more I could see. The body was in its 30s, maybe early 40s. I could see the face now, partially hidden in the water. It was a man. His eyes were wide open, glazed over, and his mouth was slightly ajar, as if he had been trying to scream but never got the chance. I reached down with trembling hands, grabbing a branch to pull him out of the water. As I did, I could feel the weight of his body, heavy and unyielding. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How could this happen here? How could someone die so far out in the woods? The moment I pulled him fully out of the creek, I could smell it. The stench of decay. It was overpowering, making my stomach lurch. His skin was pale, almost as if it had been drained of color, and the wounds on his body were deep. Whoever did this hadn't just killed him, they had tortured him. I felt the urge to run then, to leave everything behind, but I couldn't. I was frozen, staring at this stranger's body, feeling the weight of whatever had happened. Suddenly, I heard the noise again, that dragging sound. This time it was closer, much closer. It was coming from the woods. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I bolted. My legs moved on their own, carrying me through the trees, away from the body, away from whatever was out there. I didn't stop running until I reached the clearing again, panting and gasping for breath. I scrambled back into my tent, locked the zipper tight, and tried to calm myself down. My hands shook uncontrollably, and my mind raced. I couldn't make sense of any of it. Why had I stayed? What had I gotten myself into? I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. The images of the body, the sound of dragging footsteps, and the fear of whatever might be lurking outside kept me wide awake. To first light, I packed up as fast as I could. The world outside the tent felt unreal, and I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked down the mountain, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me. But no one ever did. No one ever showed up. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't report the body. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen. Something about it didn't feel right. It wasn't just the murder. It was the feeling that maybe I wasn't supposed to be there, that maybe I had stumbled onto something that should have stayed hidden. I still don't know who that man was or what happened to him, but I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, something that wasn't done yet. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I can still hear that dragging sound. I had always loved camping. The quiet of nature, the smell of pine trees, the sound of a distant creek running. Everything about it felt peaceful. That's why I decided to take a solo trip to a remote camping spot I had discovered a few months earlier, tucked deep in the mountains of Colorado. The place was secluded, far from the usual campgrounds. I thought it would be the perfect escape from the usual noise and distractions of daily life. It was late October. The leaves had already begun turning orange and red, and the air had a crisp bite to it. I had packed my gear, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, and a small camp stove, along with enough food for 3 days. The hike in was a bit tougher than I had anticipated. The trail wasn't well marked, and by the time I reached the campsite, it was already getting dark. I set up my tent under the tall pines, the area surrounded by jagged rocks and a small, winding stream. As I built a fire and settled in, I couldn't help but feel a sense of isolation. The silence was deafening. Nothing but the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. I wasn't scared, but I did feel that faint unease that comes with being completely alone in the wilderness. Night fell quickly, and with it, the temperature dropped. I wrapped myself in my jacket and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the forest around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though. Every now and then, I thought I heard something in the bushes, something that wasn't just the wind. But whenever I turned, there was nothing there. I dismissed it as my imagination, the paranoia of being in an unfamiliar place, and turned my attention back to the fire. That was when I heard it, a faint, unmistakable crunching sound coming from the brush just beyond the firelight. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal either. It sounded like footsteps. My heart began to race. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, shining it in the direction of the noise. But all I saw was darkness. I called out into the night, but there was no response. No answer. The noise stopped. The fire seemed to burn a little dimmer now. I sat still, not sure if I should stay outside or retreat into the tent. I didn't want to look like a scared fool, but that odd feeling of being watched was growing stronger. The cold, sharp air pressed down on me, making everything feel tenser. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. A deer, maybe, or the wind carrying strange sounds through the trees. I decided to stay outside a little longer, trying to settle my nerves. But then the sound came again, closer this time. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps in the dry leaves. They were slow and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was out there was making sure I heard them. I stood up, my breath caught in my throat. My instincts screamed for me to run, but I couldn't just leave my camp unattended. Could I? I had everything I needed right here. My gear, my food, my safety. But I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps grew louder. I pointed the flashlight at the trees, scanning the dark edges of the camp, but saw nothing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just out of sight, something watching me, and it wasn't friendly. I decided I couldn't just sit there any longer. My pulse raced as I moved swiftly to my tent, trying to keep calm. The tent offered little more protection than the air itself, but at least it would block the view. I zipped it shut and sat on my sleeping bag, holding my breath, listening for the sound of someone or something approaching. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. The wind picked up again, causing the trees to sway, but that unnatural stillness lingered. The steps, the crunching sound, the feeling that someone was there, waiting, it didn't go away. I tried to convince myself that I was being ridiculous, that it was just the wilderness playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I could feel it. I wasn't alone out here. The next morning, I woke up with a gnawing headache and a sense of unease. The sky was gray, overcast, and the air was damp. I packed up my things quickly, hoping to shake off whatever paranoia had gripped me the night before. But as I stepped out of the tent, I noticed something strange. The small fire I had left burning the night before, what was left of it, was completely out. No embers, no smoke. It hadn't just died out naturally. It had been put out. I searched around the camp, looking for any sign of who or what could have been out here, but I found nothing. The ground was untouched, save for the occasional animal track. I couldn't help but feel like I was missing something. I had spent enough time in the woods to know that it wasn't uncommon to run into other hikers, but the silence I had felt last night had been too much to ignore. I wasn't dealing with an ordinary hiker. The hike back to my car was uneventful, but my mind was spinning. What had happened out there? Who was in the woods with me? Why didn't I hear anything when I went to bed last night? If someone was so close. As I reached the trailhead and saw my car in the distance, I thought I could finally breathe easy. But just before I reached the car, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, lying on the hood, was my water bottle. The one I had carefully packed away in my bag. The one I hadn't used. Someone had been there. Someone had touched my stuff. They had been watching me the entire time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized that whoever it was, they had been waiting for me to leave. And now they knew I was gone. I never went back to that camping spot again. It's been years now, but I still remember that feeling. The sense of being watched, the eerie silence, and the way the woods seemed to hold their breath. I've learned to trust my instincts when it comes to the wilderness, and those instincts told me that there was someone out there just waiting for the right moment. Maybe it was human, maybe not. I'll never know, but I'll never forget that trip. I won't let myself. I never thought much about graveyards. They were just quiet places where people were buried. I'd passed by them a few times, but that was about it. That was until I found myself camping near one. My grandmother's graveyard, of all places. It wasn't a typical tourist-friendly kind of graveyard. No, this one was old, tucked deep into a stretch of forest that had long been abandoned. The road leading up to it was barely more than a dirt path, and the air always felt heavy, thick with the smell of pine and earth. It was early October when I decided to go camping alone, seeking some solitude after a tough few months. I needed a break from everything, the noise, the people, the constant barrage of thoughts. I thought a trip to the old family land would help clear my mind. My grandmother had passed away years ago, and I hadn't visited the plot in ages. But something about the idea of reconnecting with that side of the family seemed peaceful at the time. I'd always remembered how peaceful it had been there when I was younger, running through the woods and playing around the old stones. So, I packed up my gear, grabbed my tent, and drove out to the place. The first thing that struck me when I arrived was how quiet it was, eerily quiet. The forest around me stood thick, its trees tall and looming like silent sentinels. I set up camp a good distance from the graveyard itself, near a small stream that ran through the woods. It was secluded, and I liked it that way. I'd chosen this spot because I didn't want to be too close to the graves, not out of fear, but because I didn't know what to expect. It felt like a place that was forgotten by time, tucked away for no reason other than it being left behind. Night fell quickly, and with it came a sharp chill. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees and sending shivers down my spine. I built a fire, hoping to push back the cold and the loneliness. The flames crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the forest floor. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. It was peaceful, but in that unsettling way, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk. The fire had died down, leaving just a faint glow. The moon hung low in the sky, casting enough light for me to see, but the shadows still felt deep and consuming. I made my way toward the graveyard. The trees cleared as I approached, and there it was, just beyond the overgrown hedge. The gate to the graveyard creaked in the wind, its rusted hinges protesting as I pushed it open. The old headstones were weathered, leaning at strange angles. Some were covered in moss, others cracked or chipped with age. My grandmother's plot was at the far end of the cemetery, a simple stone with her name and the dates of her birth and death etched into it. I paused for a moment, standing there in the soft light, thinking about how much had changed since I was a child. I knelt down beside her grave, placing my hand on the cold stone. The wind howled again, louder this time, and I heard the distinct sound of something moving in the underbrush. It wasn't a bird or a small animal. It was something heavier, something deliberate. I looked around, my heart starting to race, but saw nothing, just the shadows stretching long in the moonlight. I stood up quickly, brushing the dirt off my pants, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking in the woods. The sensation of being watched was unmistakable, and it wasn't just the wind. The forest around me felt wrong, as if something had shifted in the air. I hurried back to my campsite, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in my chest. The fire was almost out, and the cold was creeping in. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and stoked the flames back to life. That's when I noticed it. The faint sound of footsteps, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. I froze, listening. The noise was coming from the woods, from the direction of the graveyard. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was too steady, too deliberate. The footsteps stopped just at the edge of the camp, and I held my breath. Nothing moved for what felt like an eternity. My pulse thudded in my ears, and the air felt heavier now, thicker. A rustling sound came next, just outside my tent. I didn't dare look, too afraid that if I did, I'd see something I wasn't supposed to. The wind had died down, and all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. I lay perfectly still, waiting for whatever it was to make its next move. Then a faint whisper, a voice, barely audible over the wind. It wasn't a person's voice, though. It was soft and distant, as if coming from the trees themselves. The whisper grew louder, but I couldn't make out the words. It sounded almost like a chant, repetitive and rhythmic, like something ancient and forgotten. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, the beam slicing through the trees. But there was nothing. The forest was still. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I just heard, but I couldn't. It felt like the forest itself was alive, breathing, watching me. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. The thought of staying there another minute filled me with dread. I grabbed the last of my gear and ran toward my truck, only stopping to look back once. The cemetery stood silent behind me, the headstones standing like sentinels in the night, unmoving and cold. I drove off, not daring to stop until I was miles away. The strange feeling of being watched never left me, and to this day, I wonder what I heard that night. If it was just my mind playing tricks or something far darker. I never went back to that place, and I don't think I ever will.